4 years ago, I think it was, 4, maybe 5, I spent my summer vacation on a jury in a murder trial. What's that?
Was it DP?
No, it was not. While it was going on, however, right in the adjacent courtroom was a capital case going on. And there's no reason I couldn't have drawn that one either. But I ended up somehow, God only knows how, being the foreman. I'm still not too sure.
Surprise.
No, well.
Does it count if you tried capital or tried homicide cases? I haven't tried a death penalty, but I've tried several.
That's fair. Okay, that would work. Okay, although you don't really have you don't have the power of judgment in your hands like a jury would.
Limited power as to who's on the jury.
True. Which no charge for this part, but there were probably 100 of us in the jury pool for this, and the judge starts querying the jurors, potential jurors. Both attorneys had let me go. Had let it go and had no objection. But the judge started asking us questions, and he said, "I see on your form you're a professor." He said, "What do you teach?" And I should have thought of something better, but I said, "Well, I teach ethics." And the whole place just comes unglued. The whole place cracked up like I thought, well, what's so funny about that?
Why can't I teach ethics?
Yeah, and it must have been, surely he's making this up to get out of jury duty. But then the judge said, "Well, I see you teach at a religious college." And he said, "Do you think you can follow the law?" I said, "What? Well, what's with that?"
Ask.
But what he wanted to find out. What do you think he was after?
He just wanted to find out if you were going to be too gracious. He wanted to find out if you were going to impose the law.
Okay, all right. Now that maybe it turned out that's not what he was after.
Really?
He said,
Too pro.
no.
Really?
He said what he wanted to know is if I believed that there was a higher law than the law of the land. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I do believe that. And I'm not quite sure what he was doing with that. But I said, frankly, I think it's unlikely that there would be a conflict between the law of God and the law of the land. And I think that the attorneys, the prosecutor thought, this is a right-wing, gun-owning, pro-life, pro-death penalty person. This is just what I want. And I think the public defender thought, seminary prof, Christian ethic. He's probably some fuzzy-headed liberal who teaches in a Presbyterian seminary somewhere. Or, who teaches at Claremont School of Theology, who thinks, who is going to be gracious and, let him off. And so I passed. And then once it came time to deliberate, then the ethics guy, of course, should be the foreman, which was one of the more thankless jobs I've had. But just so you know and be forewarned here, I now take great offense to the notion that all jurors are morons. Which
Not all of them, right?
No, actually, the experience did two things. One, it restored my faith in the system, for one, because the jurors, at least on this jury, there were no public employees who easily get the time off. There were only a couple of people who were retired. Most of them were people working in business and with day jobs, and it was a huge inconvenience for them. It wasn't so much for me. It just wiped out my month of July. It wiped out half my summer break.
Those are people that are
That's right. That's right. And I mean, there was a lot of debate. We deliberated for like 4 days on the verdict. And I mean, interestingly, there were 2 guys that actually wanted to give him a pass on self-defense. And it was really interesting. The military guy, a guy in the military background, who I thought would be the most law and order guy in the room, was the one who wanted him to walk on self-defense. And so we actually did the only thing that the law allowed us to do, which the law didn't allow us to give him a pass. And the law actually didn't allow us to do a second-degree murder conviction either. The law only allowed for a manslaughter conviction. But it was a 19-year-old kid. It was really tragic. And we gave him the first 2 shots on self-defense. But it was the next 6 after the victim had sort of taken cover in his car that led to the manslaughter charge. But here's the other thing we learned from the big takeaway from this was it's the closest I've ever felt to playing God. And it was a really unnerving feeling. Because you could probably tell me better what kind of sentence he would get for that. My guess is he probably got somewhere between 8 to 12 years, something like that. But I don't know. We weren't involved in the sentencing part.
Plus, you also found true that he used a firearm in the commission of the crime.
Right. But we realize, probably by the time he gets out of jail, he'll be at the earliest in his mid to late 20s. So probably most of his 20s is gone.
What year was this?
It's probably 5 years ago. And that sense of, feeling, this responsibility for someone's fate, even though I think what we did was entirely just and correct, nevertheless, within 4 days, we probably wiped out his 20s, or something close to that, and gave him, a felony conviction that's going to stick, that will stay on his record for the duration. And whatever happens to him in prison. I imagine how, if this were a capital case, how that would have been magnified, that sense of responsibility magnified exponentially. And it made sense. For the first time, it made sense how someone, or it was understandable, how someone could say, I support the death penalty in principle, but I could never vote for it. Okay? Now again, I think whether that's a justifiable position is a different question. But I get how somebody can get to that place. Now, to be fair, I don't think my views on the death penalty changed at all. What changed, I think, was the degree of how I got sobered up with what the process involves, and how serious that is. To literally hold someone's fate, the 12 of us held his fate in our hands. And I don't know if he had walked, I don't know what the judge would have done on that. I suspect the public defender was thrilled with the outcome.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he was. So.
But it sounds like it was appropriate too.
I think it was. Yeah.
You say that, and I understand that there are cases where you would say, I agree with the death penalty, but I don't see that it's applicable here. But let's say, for example, that you're convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that a person has murdered and possibly inflicted some torture on 13 separate women on 13 separate occasions. Would you say that the death penalty isn't necessarily appropriate in that situation?
Not. I think there's probably I think there are some, regardless of where you are on this. I think there are probably some cases where the justice argument for the death penalty has more merit than others. To where, I think, for example, the only person I think that have a huge problem with this would be the pure abolitionist. But I think you can make a good argument, regardless, unless you're over there, okay? Because for the pure abolitionists, nobody gets the death penalty. End of story. It's never just. Okay? And so what you do, Mark, is you use scenarios like that to smoke out how principled is your commitment to this. Because even I think if you're a procedural abolitionist, you still have to address scenarios like that. So, and even to make it even clearer, let's say that he had this sort of voyeuristic thing, and he captured all of the murders on camera. So there's no doubt that he did it. There, I think you can make a much better case that there's an unfairness or an injustice involved in not administering a death sentence. Now, for example, I think had Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City, it killed 165 people. I think if he had gotten a life term without parole, I think most people would say there's something not quite right with that.
No evidence against him was circumstantial.
Every bit. Right? Now,
he still probably wouldn't have lasted very long in prison.
There's probably something to that. Okay? So, if this is what I tried to do in the case on this, what I want you to do with this is I tried to smoke out your principled position on this, where it's a capital case, it meets the standard of the law, and there is no doubt about the guilt of the defendant. So it'd be something like, he shot came in a robbery, shot a convenience store clerk in cold blood, execution style, that was caught on surveillance cameras. Something like that. Right. So what I want you to do with this is to get to, I want to get to your principled position on this. I think it's you can have whatever procedural reservations you want. Okay? And it may be that if you have significant procedural reservations, like there's some of these things that I'm very, very troubled about, that you might end up concluding that even though I don't see anything wrong in principle with the death penalty, that I have so many procedural reservations about this that for all practical purposes, I am a procedural abolitionist. That's what we mean by that position. Okay? That in my view, is a defensible position. And what you'll probably find is the degree to which procedural reservations are significant probably varies widely. So there are some who I think would have maybe, they would find them less troubling than others would. Okay. Okay. So anyway, I just want to be clear about sort of what we're expecting on the case on that. And what I really want you to do is to wrestle with the biblical teaching on this. Because this is what I think makes this a little trickier than it looks at first glance, because the Bible actually has a lot to say on the death penalty. It's just there's not very much of it that's directly addressed to the church today. In fact, there's actually quite a paucity of material outside Old Testament law. Okay, so, you know, you have to defend the relevance of those parts of the law for today. Okay? And unless you are a theonomist, is familiar with those guys? The theonomists are a small group of very bright people, what I call radical reformed folks, who believe that the Old Testament law ought to be the law of the land today, including the death penalty for things beyond first-degree murder. You can look up some of those guys. They're a very interesting group. I've had a few of them in class here, and this discussion is very interesting with them.
There's also a movement presently towards death penalty for rape.
Right. And there are other parts of the world that have capital punishment for quite a wide variety of things. Like, please don't deal drugs in Thailand or Singapore, among other places. Okay. Yes.
What was the group called again?
Theonomy. R.J. Rushdoony is the theologian who's probably best known. Greg Bonson is another.
So would they advocate a theocracy?
Mm-hmm.
That's the
Yep,
fundamental...
explicitly. Yep. It's just basically it'd be a Christian form of an Islamic republic. No, they're a very interesting group.
But it sounds like it would be almost similar to the Judaizers.
Oh yeah. Oh, of course. Which is why they're still a relatively small group. Okay. All right. Now we got everybody clear on what the three primary positions are. The abolitionist position is much more absolute than the retentionist. The retentionist is not, in general, I don't know too many retentionists who would be absolute about it or saying we are obligated to administer the death penalty for every first-degree murder. I don't know anybody. I'm not aware of anybody who holds that view. But the retentionist basically says there's nothing wrong in principle with the death penalty in it. There's nothing wrong administering it when the conditions laid out in the Scripture are the case. So this, I think, is the one that we'll probably have the most discussion about, because I think it's reasonable to have some procedural concerns. But how influential those are and sort of where you end up along the continuum, there's a lot. I think there's a lot of room for discussion about that. Okay, is that what you with me on that? Okay.
All right, so my question has more to do with numbers.
We're coming. We'll come to that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think that's how that applies today is, I think, probably the trickiest part of this, because we sat in this murder trial that, God forbid, I would ever have to sit through again. We sat 2 days of testimony from the forensic pathologist, which was to be nothing like CSI, I assure you. It was excruciatingly boring, for one. And this guy had no personality whatsoever. But the level of precision was staggering. Because in fact, I can't believe it took him 2 days to do it. But we knew the trajectory of all 8 of those bullets from the moment they left the gun until they either lodged in his body or landed on the ground. And I learned a lot more about this victim's anatomy than I ever cared to know. And I remember walking out of court that day, and I passed the victim's mother, who was sitting in the back row. And I remember thinking, God forbid that a parent would ever have to watch something like that. But the level of sophistication was staggering. And so how we take a command that was clearly given within the limitations of the ancient world, not only in the Mosaic Law, but make that, how we flesh that out today. That's a huge challenge, because there are some very well-known people who take Numbers 35:30 literally. Charles Colson, for example. His argument is that that's the standard, and that if we applied that, he's basically said most people on death row would have their sentences changed to a life sentence if we followed that. Right? Now, whether that's necessary to take that literally, my own, I'm not too sure about that. I think that it's possible to take that, like we take other parts of the Mosaic Law, as indicative of a more general principle that can be applied in a variety of different ways. Okay? So, but I just want to make sure we're clear about this. This is the cleanest view of them all. It just says, no, under any circumstance, it's always barbaric. And usually the argument has something to do with that civilized societies just don't do this anymore. Okay. All right, now let's be clear about some of the biblical teaching on this. Genesis 9:6, in my view, is the foundation on which all of the teaching in the Mosaic Law is based on the death penalty. And the Mosaic Law actually expands what is a very general principle in Genesis 9:6, which we actually know from Genesis that there were exceptions to that made. And some have actually suggested there may be something to this, that Genesis 9:6 functions somewhat analogous to a proverbial statement. That's a general rule of thumb, but that it admits of maybe more than a handful of periodic exceptions. Right? You guys have hermeneutics and the way we read the Proverbs as general rules of thumb, not as ironclad guarantee. We're familiar with that? Okay. And some have suggested that we ought to read Genesis 9:6 like that. At the least, I think it forms the foundation for the rest of Old Testament teaching on this. And the law actually expands what's necessary. The law, for example, gives the notion of premeditation that our criminal law includes today. It gives the conditions under which the death penalty can be administered. It lays out that perjury in a capital case is a capital crime itself. The law distinguishes between murder and manslaughter. Lots of different things. So But the connection, what exactly is the force of Genesis 9:6? In my view, this is a troubling biblical text for the principled abolitionists. Now, to be fair, to be honest, I actually think that's about the only text that I would say is really troublesome for the principled abolitionists. Because after you get out of Old Testament law, and see, part of the argument, I think, for making the law relevant is that it's based fundamentally on Genesis 9:6. Sort of in the same way that we said a lot of the rest of Old Testament teaching on marriage, family, and procreation goes back to Genesis 1 and 2. We'll make that argument again when we come to Leviticus 18 and 20 with regard to sexual ethics. That the reason all of those illicit sexual relationships are what they are is because of the foundation that's laid in Genesis 1 and 2. And so the same would hold for the teaching on the death penalty, that the ultimate authority for that teaching and its relevance comes not from the law, but from the Genesis text that undergirds it. Hey, now, Genesis 9:6 explicitly connects human beings being made in God's image with an allowance, at least an allowance for the death penalty. Now, for the abolitionist, this seems somewhat counterintuitive at the start. We summarize this in the reading by suggesting that this is an odd way to protect the sanctity of life. Okay? So what exactly is the connection between the image of God and the sanctions of the death penalty? And we need to have something better than deterrence for today. Right? Because deterrence, we just don't know what the deterrent, we probably won't ever know the deterrent value of the death penalty. I just think it's just impossible to know. Because there's so many factors that go into the incidence of violent crime. But what's the connection with the image of God here? Obviously, there's something sacred about life that comes from human beings being made in God's image that connects to the death penalty. But what is that? Let's see if we can articulate what that connection is.
You could say something along the lines of when a person takes another person's life, they are disregarding, they're choosing consciously to disregard the connection that God's image is in them. And in that way, in that disregarding, they're forfeiting the image of God that would be in them. Maybe to make that kind of argument, which is, kind of more validates the idea of justice.
Well, certainly it's implied that when you take innocent life, you forfeit your own right to life. And remember that you have to qualify that. The sixth commandment, sixth commandment says, thou shalt not murder. The sixth. Right? And there are, again, we're getting ahead of ourselves on this a little bit, but I think it's pretty clear that the Scripture lays out exceptions to the mandate, thou shalt not kill, which is not what the sixth commandment says, but the exceptions to the allowable killing in the Scripture does seem to be in self-defense, in a just war, and with the death penalty. Right? So, the command not to murder presumes there mean, murder, the charge of murder presumes that the victim is innocent. Okay? So to say thou shalt not murder presumes that it's not one of those three categories. And so that biblically speaking, you can't make the argument that in a just war, in an appropriate self-defense, or in a just death penalty, that a murder's been committed. Now, of course, it's possible to commit murder in all three of those, right? But assuming that the parameters are, set up correctly, you can't say. And there's a lot of people who will suggest that that the death penalty is this idea that two wrongs suddenly make a right. Right? Well, that premise is not true, because you with me on this? That premise presumes that what you're doing in the death penalty is analogous to what was done to the innocent person. Right? And the Scripture won't let you call a properly executed death penalty murder. Okay, you just want to be clear about that, because sometimes when we say that two wrongs don't make a right, there's all sorts of things being smuggled into that we need to be careful about. Okay? So, you can answer my question about the image of God?
I'm gonna at least add something.
I haven't answered it yet.
We talk about the wages of sin as death,
Mm-hmm.
and we're dishonoring God with sin.
Right.
And it strikes me that it has to do with the value of what is taken, since man is in God's image. So that would be a high value. It has to do with the value of what is taken.
Okay. All right. Okay. So that the penalty then the severity of the penalty would reflect the value. Well, we'll put it this way: the severity of the penalty would reflect the seriousness of the crime,
right,
which then would reflect the value of what's taken. I take it. That's sort of the point you're making?
The seriousness of the crime is tied to the value of what is
Right.
taken.
Right. Okay. Okay.
I have to think this through, but it seems like any number of Old Testament examples, God allows for or even commands the execution of individuals who are creating an impure environment between man and the relationship of God. So going back to this image of God, it seems like if you don't have respect for one of God's creations, somebody that's made in his image, then that puts you in the camp of being in the impure side. And
right.
we have lots of examples of God removing those impurities from the
right.
nation
right.
to enable and enhance their ability to honor him.
Okay.
So
where are you going with that?
I'm thinking that
I'm glad to hear that.
I could go off track really easy.
Don't.
I think it's you've destroyed something made in the image of God, so you're slapping God in the face by saying, to what Mark's point is that you're not holding what God's created in value
Okay.
and esteeming
Okay.
his creation.
Certainly, the Scripture adds a dimension to the justice argument that is often given. That by destroying the image of God in a person, you are also committing an injustice to God
That's what
in
I'm
this.
trying to get.
Yeah.
That was it.
That's why I get the big bucks.
Well, that's kind of where I was going with the wages of sin.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think there's something to that. That the justice argument, it looks a little different in a theological framework. Okay. Now, I think you've obviously done an injustice to the person whose been killed, whose life has been taken. Okay. And I think you could make a plausible argument for the death penalty simply on the life for life basis. But what magnifies that theologically is the sacredness of life and the offense against God that is also part of the package. Right? So I think there's my point here is that I think there's more to it than just deterrence, and more to it than just justice for the victim. There's a theological component that makes this an offense and injustice committed against God as well. Now, see, the justice part of this, I think that's another really hard question for the principled abolitionist. Okay? And this is the question I'd want to raise. For the Christian abolitionist, I think I'd want to raise, how do you account for Genesis 9:6 and with your view? Okay? The second question I want to raise for the principled abolitionist is, what is intrinsically wrong with requiring life for life? What is intrinsic? I mean, by intrinsically, I'm not referring to the procedural stuff or the fact that mistakes can be made. Okay? What is it that's fundamentally unfair about requiring life for life? I think that's in my view, that's a hard question for the abolitionist. Okay? Don't worry, I've got hard questions for the retentionist too. Okay, now, what about in the New Testament? For one, there's hardly anything on the death penalty in the New Testament. I can think of at least two good reasons why that's the case. Okay? One's biblical, one's sociological. The biblical one is that it was unnecessary because it was so clear in the Old Testament. Right? Which, there may be something to that. The sociological reason, which had to do with the first century culture, was that for Jews, or for the church too, it was clearly a moot point, since the Romans, not the Jews, had the authority ultimately to administer the death penalty. And so for Jesus, it's irrelevant. It's not an issue until the Pharisees tried to trap him in John chapter 8. So now, I'm not sure anything follows from the fact that the New Testament has so little to say about it. And there's some allusions. Paul alludes to this in Acts 26, where he says, if I've committed a capital crime, then by all means, the death penalty is just. Right now, he's probably more speaking to the way things are than the way things ought to be. Right? But at least, even if he's speaking to the way things ought to be, I'd want a little bit more to go on than an allusion. And I think Romans 13 is probably, it is the primary place in the New Testament that speaks to this. But I wish it were a little bit clearer on this. Paul in Romans 13:4 says the state does not bear the sword in vain, or the state does not bear the sword for nothing. Now, it's really clear from the context that Paul's affirming the state and its place in criminal justice. that that's the state's responsibility. The sword is clearly being used there as a figure of speech for criminal punishment. Now, a lot of the debate is over, is it being used as a figure of speech for something more than just criminal punishment in general? That's obvious from Romans 13, that the state has that obligation. So if we try to put ourselves back into the shoes of the readers in the first century, how were they most likely to have understood that figure of speech? Well, I think it's not unreasonable to suggest that most people in the first century saw swords primarily as instruments that did what? Cause death, right? You didn't smack somebody around with a sword. So I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that figurative language supports the notion that the state is authorized to administer the death penalty. Right? Now, hold on just a minute. That doesn't mean that there aren't times when you shouldn't be a procedural abolitionist, even if you accept everything we've said so far. Right? For example, I had a student who sat right in your seat, basically. And she was this really sharp woman. She had been she's Filipino. And she had been in the Filipino equivalent of Wall Street before coming to faith and coming to Talbot. And she was only she couldn't have been 5 feet tall. She's this little powerhouse Filipino woman who said, I'm a procedural abolitionist because in my country, the death penalty is given out at the whim of the judge. And the system is so corrupt, and there are all sorts of people who are given death sentences who ought not be, because the system is just almost beyond redemption. And she said, no doubt that some of those death sentences were appropriate. But she said, I would never vest the authority to administer the death penalty to a judge, for one, who is so subject to bribery and corruption in a system that's so subject to bribery and corruption. And I thought she had a pretty compelling point. So that we need to be aware of it may be that in the part of the world that you're going to end up ministering in, what a procedural abolitionist would look like in the Philippines is real different than what it might look like here. Although here I was going to say in Europe, but there's no place in Europe that has the death penalty. In fact, it'd be very interesting to talk to some of our students who are from Europe. We had Melissa Tan was in the class. Melissa from AS. She was in the class last semester, and you could tell she was really wrestling with some of this because she put it, almost nobody in the Christian community in Britain thinks the death penalty is appropriate. We've had students from Belgium, we had a guy from Sweden in here. And I remember, he had his jaw dropped when I took a show of hands on that case, and most people raised their hand to say the death penalty is appropriate. He could hardly believe it, because it is so unusual in the Christian community for this to be of a valid option. So those are the Christian community, I think, is around the world, I think would tend far more on the abolitionist side. this is clear. I mean, I bet there's hardly anybody in Catholic circles or in mainline denominational circles who holds the death penalty as a valid option. Okay, so we need to be aware of that. There are a couple other places that are often appealed to by abolitionists to support their view, neither of which, in my judgment, have much to say about it. Okay? The statement of Jesus in his confrontation with the woman caught in adultery, okay? Apart from the obvious textual problems with that narrative, are we all clear on that? I mean, there's a huge debate as to whether that's in the part of the original text or not. But assuming that it is, for the moment, why wouldn't we say that Jesus is making an authoritative statement here on the death penalty? He says,
You would be assuming that the state has that same mandate to forgive.
okay, all right, okay. Yeah, so, okay, hold on. You made a great point. Don't get off your great point here, okay? Which actually relates to the Sermon on the Mount also. That the state is not in the business of forgiveness, right? Except at the end of every presidential term. Then for 24 hours, it is, tragically, okay? Where there's more legalized bribery that goes on in that 24-hour period than we know what to do with. Okay, so, I mean, if we're going to be consistent with what Jesus taught in John 8 and in the Sermon on the Mount, because giving a murderer a life sentence doesn't exactly fulfill the mandate of the Sermon on the Mount, right? Right? Okay. So that the idea, your faith has saved you, go and sin no more, implies that the state, that implies that the alternative to the death penalty is forgiveness, okay? Not a range of criminal punishments in between. Okay? So you raise a really good point on that.
I also have a problem with, when it comes to matter, when I'm assisting a doctor, I have to go through a certain amount of procedure, and there's a set amount of guidelines that I have to follow alongside the doctor. Why is it when we're dealing with things that are relevant to theology that you can sort of pick and choose, and you don't have to filter through the hermeneutic in that in order to organize?
That's a great.
About the text, and then after you have that, then we can kind of
Very good. No, that's right.
critically think about
That's
it. I'm not sure why that happens.
well because good hermeneutics often produces disturbing results to our ethics. And some of it I would say is actually hermeneutical laziness. But I think some of it is a sense of, my position is set in stone, and don't bother me with the proper reading of Scripture.
But this is also discipline too. You should have
Oh, that's right. No, that's exactly right. That's right.
guidelines when you're talking about this, and this is relevant.
That's right.
And moral process. So I'm not sure that we're approaching it properly, and how can you arrive at a sound conclusion when you get to this discipline that we're learning.
Right. No, that's right.
I'm not sure how you arrive there, at an accurate.
That's what we're now I'm not sure who you're aiming who's the target that you're aiming at here. I'm not quite sure about that, but I'll assume the worst on this, and but I do think there are folks on both sides of this that are guilty of what you're suggesting, of what I would call just playing it fast and loose with the biblical teaching. Okay? And I think there's lots of advocates of the death penalty who cite the Mosaic Law uncritically and they have this. I think they have the same hermeneutical problem that the abolitionist does, who cites the Sermon on the Mount uncritically. Right? Now, what I've been trying to do here is to sketch out the highlights of that by going to each text that addresses the death penalty and seeing it in its context. In the Old Testament part, seeing it within the context of the Mosaic Law, and sort of pressing us to do our hermeneutical homework in determining how it's relevant. And that was the point of the question I raised at the very beginning, is that on what basis can we say that the Mosaic Law is relevant at all to this, is fundamentally a hermeneutical question.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.